Having established that via the use of social engineering, the powers that be can mould and shape what people perceive to be right and wrong, or good and evil, and that by doing this they are maintaining a type of balance, which I described in Appledore as an anti-balance, which is essentially a negative polarity, and understanding that by maintaining this negative polarity they perceive themselves to be the sole arbiters of dark and light, or yin and yang, whereby a false superficial conscience is inculcated into the populace using paramoralisms and cultural values to create this false conscience, which itself consists of a bipolar conflict between the ego playing the role of the angel and the shadow playing the role of the devil. Where exactly does this leave the individual who rightly transcends this false paradigm? So you've jumped off the black and white checkerboard, meaning that you're one step closer to claiming your selfhood, having integrated the shadow, but what now? Well, this is usually where the Luciferian or the New Ager will enter the picture and claim that by transcending this false dualistic construct, you have transcended morality itself, and that you have overcome the notion of good and evil, and that you are beyond right and wrong. And they will point out the fake pseudo-morality that you left behind and tell you that you are now enlightened. However, this is an extremely duplicitous lie. Knocking down a straw man version of morality does not negate the fact that there are such a thing as real moral principles. Moral relativism proponents will argue that there is no right and wrong, and morals are simply arbitrarily defined ideals relative to whichever culture that you happen to be a part of. This is an erroneous argument that stems partly from the fact that it is so often repeated that many believe it to be true, and partly from the discomfort that it causes those who would rather not acknowledge it. Yes, there are paramoralisms and values. Yes, both of those aforementioned things are relative. But what about morals? Where do morals arise from? The answer is your conscience. No, not the straw man pseudo-conscience of ego versus shadow. The real conscience of inherent spiritual wisdom, which comes from the true self, the higher self. This is why you should be very wary of people who try to insinuate that enlightenment means you are beyond good and evil. These types of people will claim that fear, guilt, and anger are low vibratory emotions, and therefore that they're somehow illegitimate and should not be a part of your reality, meaning they should be avoided like some poignant memory that you'd rather not acknowledge, buried beneath the substratum of your psyche. In other words, they claim these emotions should be suppressed. Your run-of-the-mill positive thinking New Ager will invariably claim that one should exist in the now, neither living in the past nor anticipating the future. While there is much truth to this, we should perhaps take something into consideration here. According to Robert Hare, who developed the psychopathy checklist, psychopaths, like New Agers, exist in the now. In his book Without Conscience, Hare writes, quote, "Although a student of New Age philosophies might shudder at the desecration of sacred principles, much of the psychopath's behaviour and motivation makes sense if we think of him or her as a person rooted completely in the present and unable to resist a good opportunity." Unquote. So we can see here that existing in the now, or living in the moment, is a psychopathic character trait. That is not to suggest that it is an intrinsically bad thing, more so that we cannot simply go our entire lives living in the now, if our conscience is functioning the way that it should. Psychopaths also tend to be positive thinkers, further bringing into question the notion that one should always think positive. The film American Psycho features a scene in which the psychopathic character Patrick Bateman murders a homeless man and his dog, but before doing so he lectures the man about getting a job and says, "You've got a negative attitude, that's what's stopping you." This is typical of the New Age blame the victim mentality, whereby the New Ager will claim that anything bad that happens to a person is a result of their own negative attitude. So a starving child in Africa is, according to this New Age philosophy, bringing on his or her own problems by thinking negative. One example of this callous indifference to human suffering, so prominent among so-called positive thinking ideologues, comes from the author of The Secret, Rhonda Byron, who claimed that people who were killed in the 2006 tsunami brought about the tsunami themselves by sending out the wrong kind of vibrations, because apparently nothing happens to us that we do not attract. This lack of compassion is very much a characteristic of psychopathy. On the opposite end of that spectrum is the victim mentality, the notion that nothing that happens to you is your fault, that there is always some big bad who is responsible for all your problems, and that you have no agency or accountability for anything. In other words, the social toddler. Through social engineering, victim classes are created, and people that fall into said classes are given just as privilege to say or do what they want. Not because the social engineers value or have any kind of respect for these classes, but for just the opposite reason, that being that they have zero respect for them and view them as toddlers who are too stupid to hold responsibility and should therefore be immune to consequences. One example of this jester's privilege would be the woman who initiates violence against males and then acts like a victim when certain males respond in kind, as if she is some kind of innocent battered wife who burnt the toast. People will say there's never an excuse to hit a woman. Why not? Well, because she's weaker. But when a stronger man attacks a weaker man, or when a stronger woman attacks a weaker woman, this superficial, phony sense of piety disappears completely. Never hit a woman is a paramoralism. You shouldn't be hitting anyone. So don't act self-righteously when you hit someone and they defend themselves. Being weaker does not give you the right to hit people and then hide behind your jester's privilege like a coward. Unless you really are a toddler, in which case you'll revoke your right to be treated as an adult. Remember, a jester is a fool, and a fool's privilege is not really a privilege at all. It is a passport to failure. And by failure, I mean moral and spiritual decay. So, if you really are weaker, then don't throw stones if you live in a glass house. Now, I want to make it clear that it is certainly not okay to hit a woman without being put in a position that leaves you with little other option. And as for the type of sicko who would, without provocation, attack a woman, no man in his right mind would disagree that such a man is a coward and a lowlife. But that's not the issue here. We're talking of a particular type of female. The female abuser who hides behind her victim mentality. And I'm going to return to that subject a little bit later on. At any rate, victim mentality is a self-inflicted spiritual disease. We should take some time now to examine what the New Age Luciferians consider to be negative emotions. According to many New Agers and moral relativists in general, guilt is a negative emotion because it makes you feel bad. The train of thought being that if something makes you feel bad, you should avoid it altogether because it is quote-unquote negative. This is absolute nonsense. Guilt might make you feel bad, but it serves a very necessary function, and that is to tell you when you have done something wrong. If you stick around in a bonfire, you will experience pain. That pain, while unpleasant, is a very positive thing. It alerts you to the fact that you are burning, and it prompts you to remove your hand before you do any permanent damage. Well, the same is true for guilt. Guilt comes as a result of empathy and is there to tell you when you have wronged somebody else. Your guilt is your conscience, not the false construct of ego versus shadow, but the real conscience that is inherent within the self. Without conscience, you cease to be human and you become a psychopath. This is what Antichrist consciousness is. It is a psychopathic consciousness. So I'd be very wary, if I were you, when people encourage you to lose your humanity and call it enlightenment. This is not enlightenment. This is making yourself in the image of the Antichrist consciousness. Now, of course, it should be noted that guilt can be used in a manipulative way, which is to say you can be made via paramoralisms to feel guilty about things that are not your fault. This is why we should always use our discernment and rationality to avoid falling into such a trap. So to be clear, Just As Pain will alert you that something is wrong and keep bugging you and bugging you and bugging you until you take care of the injury. Guilt will bug you until you right whatever wrongs you have committed. If on the other hand you decide to take some painkillers and ignore your injury, it will not heal, or at least depending on the severity of the injury, it will get worse. If you suppress your guilt, it is the equivalent to taking painkillers and ignoring the injury. Moreover, by suppressing your conscience, it will become an aspect of your shadow self. So in closing, guilt is your conscience. Your conscience is your humanity. Ergo, without guilt, you cease to be human. Anger is another emotion that is demonised by New Age moral relativists. They will postulate that anger is negative and therefore you should not get angry. There is also an argument to be made that anger clouds your judgment. To refute the former, we should define exactly what anger is. So, what is anger? Anger is our sense of injustice. That is to say, it is the feeling that an injustice has occurred and that that injustice needs to be rectified. Now, just like guilt, anger can be misguided and used in a manipulative way. Someone could be kept in a perpetual state of anger by a manipulator to be used in a nefarious way. They could be tricked into believing that someone has wronged them in some way or that someone owes them something or the other, when in reality they haven't been wronged and that somebody owes them nothing. So our anger can certainly be used against us. Anger can also be misplaced, and this happens when our sense of justice is dictated by the ego as opposed to the self. Just as the fake replica of our conscience, ego versus shadow, can produce guilt when there is no need for guilt, so too can it produce anger when that anger is unwarranted. For example, you could be playing a game against someone or the other and you lose that game, causing you to fly into a rage. Providing the loss was fair, anger in this case is unwarranted, meaning it is not based on any true injustice. This is an example of the ego hijacking your sense of justice and redefining it for its own purposes. When the ego is given carte blanche to dictate what it feels is right or what it feels is wrong, then your judgment will indeed be clouded. So, when is anger truly justified? Well, to answer that, think back to what I said about the manipulator who tricks you into believing that someone has wronged you, when in reality they have not. Certainly, you would not be justified in aiming your anger at the accused if they are innocent. But the manipulator, on the other hand, the false accuser, you would be perfectly within your right to get angry at, as would the accused. If you swallowed what the manipulator told you and blindly believed what they said, flying into a rage against the accused, then that accused individual would be justified not only in their anger at the manipulator, but at you as well. That is justifiable anger, or righteous indignation. So the key lies in distinguishing between just anger, coming from the self, and unjust anger, coming from the ego. Now, by no means is this always an easy thing to do, but it is the right thing to do. Anger serves a necessary purpose and should be expressed in the face of injustice. Choosing to ignore your anger and trying to repress it will result in bitterness, injustice, and a distorted perception of reality. To not feel anger is to not be human, and to not be human is to feel that you are somehow above the concept of right and wrong. Fear is discussed ad nauseum by plenty of truth seekers, and with good reason, as it is the primary tool used against us, in order to keep us obedient and susceptible to manipulation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time delving into the positive aspect of fear. I'll simply say that in short bursts, fear has its purpose. Primarily it warns of impending danger. At times it is a false warning, and at times it is a legitimate alarm. The issue I'm going to tackle is a certain New Age line of thought, and this line of thought suggests that fear is bad, ipso facto. Anything that evokes fear should be avoided. So, if you make a truthful statement, and that statement is scary, these people will ignore you and probably make a self-righteous, condescending remark about how you're stuck in fear and you need to spiritually evolve. This is a somewhat ironic thing to say, because if you spend your life avoiding things that scare you, then you are, by definition, living in fear. Using the flawed logic these people exhibit, if a train was heading towards one of them, and you warned them about that train, you would be a fearmonger. I mean, they would probably stand there and bleat on and on about how the train was just a projection of the psyche, and how we are one with the train, and the train is splat. Yeah, that's where that line of thought will get you, so good luck with that. Fear has its purpose. Just don't let it dictate your actions, or your lack thereof. So, having established that these emotions serve a necessary function, and as such should not be characterised as intrinsically negative, nor suppressed, where do we go from here?